Hello. We'll go ahead and try and get everybody's attention so we can get started. Hello.
Mike's hot too.
We're going to go ahead and try and get started. Maybe. Let's settle down and get ready for the afternoon. First thing I'd like to do is encourage everybody to move forward if you see seats at any tables that are empty, so that we'll be more intimate and able to work together. I want to again take this opportunity to thank all of y'all for being here, and what an exciting couple of speakers we had today. I think the program that Joe and Chuck put on for us was remarkable, and I had said 3 times better than I expected, and Howard Morrison said no, 4 times it was a grand slam, and I agree with that. This afternoon we're going to have a panel discussion, and it's open for you guys to ask any questions you want. We're honored to have Howard Morrison act as our moderator today. Howard has been a community catalyst for years and years and has been involved in everything you can imagine, from public education to transportation, politics, and everything, trying to help move our city forward. I'd like to thank Howard again, and I'm going to turn the mic over to him so he can be our moderator.
Thanks so much, Dicky. It's an honor to be up here with these distinguished guests. You know, this morning we had a lot of conversation about the big picture, the macro, what's going on in other cities, what's going on around the world, what are some of the mega trends. This afternoon, though, I hope we'll have an opportunity to drill down and think about our little city, Savannah, and maybe the surrounding area as well, however we might define Savannah. And Chuck, you made a comment at the end of your presentation, and I think we ought to start off by sort of focusing on that if we could. You said that there's a lot of genius here, and I would agree with you. I'm not one of them, but there's a lot of genius here out in the audience. But the question that you posed to us is, do we have the courage to do what needs to be done? And how do we define what needs to be done? And how do we know what we did and how we did it when we get there? So I want to sort of ask you the first question, you know, how do we develop that courage?
It's a really good question. And I'm not sure, you know, as an engineer, as a planner, that I'm the right person to say. I will say, from a genius standpoint, I'm sure there are people in this room who are genius. I'm sure there are people in this community who are genius. When I look at Savannah, the genius I see is like in your DNA. It's the genius of time manifested in a place. Someone was asking me during the break for 3 authors that I like to read, and I mentioned Nassim Taleb and Jared Diamond and John Dominic Crossan, and all 3 of them taught me to be humble in a way that I think as Americans we're not wired to be today. When you have enough money to build a bridge, screw that up and then say, well, we'll just tear that bridge down and build something else. When you have enough money to rip down a block, build a big civic center, and then come back later and say, yeah, that was a dumb move, and then rip it down. You don't have to think real hard. You don't have to be real sophisticated. But when you can't overcome your mistakes by brute force, it requires you to have an inner genius, to be smarter and more thoughtful about what you do. And when you do that in this community, I think the courage maybe is to step back and to acknowledge that the people who came before you, and I say that in the broadest sense of the word, not just here, but you know, from influences all around the world, really descendant from people from the Fertile Crescent who built the first cities. What you're looking at in the historical neighborhoods of Savannah is a genius developed over a long period of time. And when we're lost and confused, what do we do? This isn't working. To me, I think the courageous thing is to say, I'm going to be humble. I'm going to go back to that, and I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to devote myself to learning from it. That's a hard thing for us as Americans to do, but to me, that's where the courage starts.
All right, well, if we're so smart, why do we build a civic center that was designed when it was built to last 40 years and then be torn down? Talk to me about building things to last.
Yeah, because we did it because we were we thought we were really wealthy. And we were, if you spin it in the most aspirational sense, we were reaching for the stars. We said, the future is jet cars and the Jetsons, and we're going to take like a leap that direction. We're going to leave the past behind, and we're going to go on to great things. It's Icarus, right? With we're going to fly, and then we fly too close to the sun, and it doesn't work out the way we thought. The story of Icarus is about having humility. And I think we've gone through a period of time in America where we didn't have to have humility because we had unparalleled wealth and riches. After World War II, every country in the world had their economy devastated, if not their country physically devastated. We were like the last power standing, and it allowed us a generation or more of basically we could be really dumb and still come out on top. And we're no longer there. Like, we've got to get our moxie back. We got to be smart. We got to be sophisticated. And I think the Civic Center is a great example of an age where you look back and you're like, what were they thinking? They weren't dumb. They were thinking. They just weren't humble. And I actually think that we can be like bold individuals and humble individuals at the same time.
Or were we just thinking short term and not thinking long term? And you and I discussed that a little bit at lunch. The me thinking that's about the short term and the we thinking that's more about the long term.
I think the genius of traditional development patterns is that they equilibrated, they made together the we thinking and the me thinking. And today when we build Convention Center, we build a building to last 40 years. If we step back and looked at that, we would realize what a crazy thing. And we took down buildings that had lasted way longer than that to build something that was going to be around a short period of time. We spent an enormous amount of our wealth doing that transaction. Now we're at the end of it going, what are we left with here? We're left with a huge liability. We have a development pattern today that puts selfish self-interest misaligned with the public interest. If we go back, and what that leads to is a development pattern where you get this big sugar high and then this big collapse. If we go back to the traditional development pattern, you have a development pattern that's more like meat and potatoes. And it becomes meat and potatoes because it aligns self-interest with the public interest. You have a development pattern where during good times there's growth, and then during tough times there's stagnation, but not rapid decline. So we have a development pattern that's meant to plateau. It goes up, then we hold on, then we go up, then we hold on, then we go up, and we hold on. If you're all about growth, if you're all about the sugar high, you're willing to sacrifice the long term and the drop in order to get the growth today. But if you have more of a meat and potatoes diet, what you see is that you can actually reach a plateaus of success, plateaus of prosperity that are going to be broad, wider spread, that you're not going to go back from, that more equilibrate the we and the me together. It puts those two in alignment. And I'm not a sociologist. I really am not one who, I don't think humans are different today than they were 2,000 years ago. I think there's a reason why our pattern of development developed this way, because we are innately that person in that curve I showed you. We are that person who smokes. We are that person who eats the ice cream and gets heart disease. We're wired to value things today. What our development pattern needs to do is tamper the rush to the sugar high today and put us on that more meat and potatoes. Let's build slow, let's build it up, let's make sure it lasts and has enduring qualities. That's what traditional development patterns do. And that's, I think, what we need to get back to.
Kevin, you've been here for 5.5 years. You've seen a lot of courage, I hope, and probably some more courage to come. What are your observations?
Oh, boy. That's a broad question. I mean, I think obviously when you come to Savannah as a newcomer, the thing that strikes you immediately is the landmark district and just the sheer beauty of the place. I mean, I came here on purpose. I was a little unique because I wanted specifically to live in a walkable city, and that was an experience and a lifestyle that I was looking for, and I knew Savannah had that. And I knew enough about the landmark district to sort of understand and get my arms around that. I think what I've observed and learned, especially over the last few years, is really in getting to know everything sort of outside the landmark district. And, Savannians have done a remarkable thing over the last 30 or 40 years in restoring this city and bringing it, really back to the life that it has now. But it's also, there's still so much more of it for us to value. And I think one of my observations is, even as Savannians, we may not quite value a lot of the neighborhoods that are outside the landmark district itself as much as we should. There are still remarkable, 19th century and early 20th century neighborhood fabric built on the traditional pattern that extends for several square miles around the landmark district. And I think one of the things I really enjoy about Joe and Chuck's presentations is it sort of teaches us different ways to value those and appreciate those neighborhoods, even as we may see them in a state of disrepair today. And it's very easy to sort of look at different neighborhoods and have a mindset that there's really something inherently wrong with them and that we need to do the Taco John's approach and tear it down and do the shiny and new thing, instead of figuring out how to sort of encourage that incremental improvement over time. So that's kind of one broad observation.
Joe, how about you?
I'm over here getting a sugar high.
Oh, good. That's okay.
I think when Kevin sent us the property list and JT ran the numbers on it, I think yesterday I was talking with a student from Georgetown University, and I actually opened up JT's spreadsheet and showed the really complex analysis that he did. It was actually literally one spreadsheet, 4 columns: the property, the value, the acre, the value per acre. And you saw the results of that. How many times have y'all driven by that barber shop? And did it ever flash through your mind that barber shop is more potent than Target? It's like, that's the thing that's mind-blowing to me, is that all of this stuff is hiding in plain sight. Chuck hit it. It's that humility to basically say, maybe we need some more information. Maybe I don't know everything. When I go to my doctor, I don't start debating my doctor about my health. My doctor's taking my blood pressure. He's got pulling out a stethoscope. I still don't know what a stethoscope does. He puts it on me and listens to something. But they'll do an MRI. They'll do all of this data to see what's going on inside our bodies. Yet we're sitting in these cities and we don't even know that stuff. No one answered the question: how valuable is Savannah? What's it worth? That's the first thing that we do when we get the data. We just go to the bottom of the assessor's file, we make a new cell, and we create a sum category, and it calculates the whole column. And it's real easy to get. But this is your community. You're all shareholders in Chatham County and in Savannah. So knowing your worth is important. That's a good place to start.
My question for you, though, is that you all talk about measuring the value of Savannah in dollars and cents, CENTS, and not SENCE, SE. Wow, but isn't there really the more important value, the way you value a community for the people that live in it, and not necessarily the value of the people? Isn't the common denominator happiness, fulfillment, maybe health, safety? So let's talk a little bit about the people.
I'm going to turn this on to Chuck in a second, but we did a presentation in Santa Rosa, California, and somebody in the audience asked me, he's like, well, you had that quote about the soul of your community. Can't you measure the soul?
Good question.
And I said to him, well, I think my soul's pretty cool. I think my soul's better than your soul. So how are we going to gauge that? And what kind of charter? They're actually, ironically enough that you say that, there's a book called The Happy City, written by Charles Montgomery, where he goes through all of those indicators of measuring the social well-being of a community. And it's actually, that I would recommend reading that book and starting with those metrics. And then making that part of your conversation of those measurements. But there's a book about that, yeah. Here's Chuck.
I'm going to agree with you, but I'm going to push back gently too, in a friendly way, in a Minnesota way.
Well,
So-
we don't have to be friendly. It'd
Yeah,
be more interesting if we weren't friendly.
So I think if we lined up all the things that are important to us, and we did it like a deathbed analysis, right? Like, I look back on my life, what are all the things that are important? It's not going to be money and the accumulate. But yet, the way we measure success often, and the way like Joe and I present today, is a lot about money. We have a saying at Strong Towns, one of our core principles, in fact, and it is financial solvency is a prerequisite to doing good. For a local government, for a community, financial solvency is a prerequisite for doing good. If you want to do good, and I'm working on this book, and I had this example of the homeless person. You walk home from work and you have a homeless person, and you feel very compassionate for them, and you want them to be better, so you give them your money. Every month you give them all of your paycheck, right? We say, like, this is a very good person, right? But at some point you default on your mortgage, you lose your job, and you can no longer do that. And so the question becomes, okay, how do you remain solvent and yet be able to pursue and do the good that we all, I think as humans, maybe value slightly differently, but have desires to do? And for government, it is really critical, as distasteful as sometimes people make this, we have to start with the numbers. We have to start with the numbers, we have to be rigorous about the numbers, and we have to make sure that things are solvent. Within that framework, we can do all kinds of things, but the problem that we run into is when we lose that focus, what we do is we wind up chasing, boy, my dream is a civic center. My dream is, my dream is that. And those are fine dreams, but in the context of being solvent, how do we do them? How do we do them? And when we lose that grounding, we wind up with everybody's dreams going bad. There's not a lot of dreams being fulfilled today in Detroit or Flint, Michigan. It's hard to do good when you're worried about your next meal, or when literally you call the fire department because your house is burning down and it takes 2 hours for them to get there. These are not viable systems. We have to stay financially solvent, and then we can start to have a secondary conversation about what do we do, how do we do good, and what does that mean?
How about a wise man by the name of Tamachichi in 1732, the year before Oglethorpe came? He had a pretty probably a happy life. He didn't worry about money. Maybe he worried about his next meal.
Right. Well, okay. I look at Savannah, and okay, let me give you the example from my hometown and tie it to yours. We have a square, Gregory Square. It's actually now Gregory Park because we don't know what a square is. And yeah, we went and planted, we did this thing because, I don't know why we did it, because we're messed up. We decided that it would be a really nice thing for people, when people passed away, you could go and buy a tree to have planted in the park. And you get a little plaque, and you're basically making, you pay like $500 and you get a $50 tree and a plaque, and then the park board gets the rest of the money to improve the park, right? But what's wound up happening is that our square, and you all understand squares here, squares have symmetry, they have all kinds of like important things to them. Our square is now a forest in waiting, right? Because we just have random trees planted everywhere of all different varieties and all different types. The people who built your city, and today, for the most part, except for your public works department, who puts random utility boxes in the middle of your squares, seem to grasp that this square is at one hand a public benefit, in that it creates a certain amount of aesthetic beauty, It creates a certain amount of sense of place. These are great places to be in. We saw all kinds of couples holding hands and walking through these places. I would love to have been able to do that with my wife back when we were dating. This is a beautiful place to fall in love, right? These are very nice places. But they also understood that that square made all the buildings around it like incredibly wealthy. And for blocks in every direction, those buildings are incredibly valuable, because if I can live on that square, I will pay a fortune to do that. And what you see, and we could see this last night in subsequent generations, is that the buildings tend to have that incremental growth, right? They become more intense over time. They grow up because that's such a valuable place. It drives that plateauing, right? When we get growth, we go to the next level, and then the next level, and the next level. I think systems like that combine the best of what we are as humans with, building our own solvency and making us better, is how people used to build cities. And I think if we get back to that, and Savannah is a great example of how to do things right and how to do things horrible, right? Do more of the right. To me, it's easy here, because at my home, I have to convince them that this is a square, not a forest. And they're like, well, what's the difference, Chuck? And you can just walk around for blocks and blocks and this is awesome, this is awesome, this is awesome. It's why don't you just do more of the awesome and less of the crap, right?
Well, that raises the whole questions of what should we do in terms of the two saddlebags that we sometimes refer to them as, the property on the east side of East Broad and the west side of MLK. Do we just replicate what we've done downtown, what Oglethorpe came up with, or do we do something else? What do you think, Dicky? You've been around.
Yeah, thank you. I have been around. I think that...
You've also been to Cuba. We need to talk about Cuba.
Yeah, we'll do that later. I'd like to do that. But I'm not sure I really followed your question. Are you asking about public housing, or are you asking about the...
Well, if we've got such a great plan, and I think we all agree with that. Chuck's described it with squares and wards and so on. As we develop east and west of the central business district, do we replicate
the Oglethorpe plan?
Yeah, or do we do something else? Do we build, think about Jacksonville. Jacksonville's got 40-story buildings, but Washington, D.C.'s got a height limit. So how do we think about the future of what we want Savannah collectively to look like? Not you, not me, not anybody sitting up here on the stage, but what do we want the rest of Savannah to look like? And how do we learn from the lessons of the past? And a corollary question coming up is, do we learn more from our successes, or do we really learn more from our failures?
Okay.
But what should we do as we expand east and west?
Okay, well, I think that became 10 questions, but
I counted 15.
What I'm going to say is that I think it's a great opportunity for us to talk about the immediate future of Savannah and the long-term future of Savannah. Fortunately, the city government and the new mayor are really interested in coming up with a visionary plan for the future of our city. A number of years ago, Savannah Development Renewal Authority was very lucky to spearhead, along with the Metropolitan Planning Commission, a plan for the future of the city of Savannah to kind of outline, what do we do with zoning? What do we do with mobility? How do we grow areas around Savannah? And that plan got put on a shelf. And so we really have been growing, as they say, by the seat of our pants. And it's time for us to get back to coming up with a plan that can help us determine, where do people want to live? Where do we want to have retail? What are the best places for entertainment? Do we want Savannah to be nothing but a city of hotels and tourists? I really think that we're at that point now in having the opportunity to make those changes. And then in direct answer to, should we copy the Oglethorpe plan? I don't think it's necessary to copy the plan in any way, shape, or form. I think it is as close to a perfect town plan as you will see anywhere in the world. And there are parts of it that should always be emulated. Public spaces, squares, as we mentioned earlier, thinking in terms of how do you intermix both retail, residential, and entertainment sections where people can, as they say, work, live, and play.
Actually, I have a question too for Chuck. Just one for Chuck. You had a blog post, I think, in the last week or so. I think it was called "Romancing the Stone Age,"
Yeah.
which was, I think, was probably one of the most interesting things that I've seen you write. I don't know, it kind of came out of a question at one of these forums, but it's a topic that we don't kind of talk about very much, which was the parallel economic system that might have existed 100 years ago that went with the traditional pattern. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that post and some of your thoughts that came out of it.
Yeah, it was a tough question I was asked at an event, and it made me think. I thought about it for like a month, and then I wrote that piece because the question that I got was, okay, Chuck, you showed us a bunch of pictures of your hometown in the early 1900s, but the early 1900s were kind of a despotic time for a lot of people. We had, you had a lot of disenfranchised people. Women didn't even have the right to vote. You had child labor. People had outhouses and burn barrels. And I mean, are you really saying we go back to that? And it was also a recognition that there's a certain economic system intertwined with this. Obviously, no. We have cars. We're going to have cars. We're not going to go away from having cars, and we should have cars. Cars are fantastic, especially on roads, getting us from one place to another. Why you would spend millions of dollars building a place to store your car underneath your park, I'm not sure. But, those are like limitations of how much we love our cars. But we're going to have cars, right? I think what's interesting about the traditional development pattern, and we saw this at what was the Abe on Lincoln last night? What a cool place, and cool not in a like going to show up in a tourist brochure kind of cool, but cool in I'm walking down the street. There's a bunch of people standing out there. You actually said, let's go check that out. And we went down there like, this is kind of cool. Cool in a thing that like, I'll remember that about this place. When you look at a place like that, I don't know the owners of that place, but I'm imagining that they're kind of what we would historically call bootstrappers. In America, we like to think that we are this place of great upward mobility and people can start from nothing and become something great. And when we actually study the statistics, we see that used to be true, and it's really not true today. It used to be true in the sense that people if you go back to Savannah of 150 years ago, there was an economic system where people could essentially start with very little on the edge. As things were incrementally growing out, build that little pop-up shack I showed you earlier when I had that old and blighted block, right? And the idea is that that's a cheap little building that we're getting going. And you might even have a system where the family lived in back and had a store in the front. So someone could go off working during the day and the other person could stay home and watch the kids and tend the store at the same time. And create a certain amount of like resilience in your family that was reflected in the resilience of that block and in that neighborhood and that community. But then as the place grew up, what happened is that family, their business would expand slightly. They could maybe build a living place on the second floor and have the whole first floor now for their business. They could maybe rent the top floor out to the person who minded the store, and then they could move and actually have like rentier kind of wealth, the kind of wealth that builds like real intergenerational wealth. The idea was that the prosperity could be shared in a really broad way with a lot of upstart people kind of moving in progression upward at the same time. We've taken that out, and I used in the story the example of Dunkin' Donuts. Dunkin' Donuts is coming to Minnesota. I don't know if you have Dunkin' Donuts here or not. Donut chain. Dunkin' Donuts is coming to Minnesota. What could be simpler to start than a donut shop? You have a deep fryer, a counter, and a cash register. That's it. Like the lowest capital kind of thing you could find, right? And if you were going to take that, Abe at Lincoln's box, you could easily put a donut shop in that. It is like the easiest thing to start, right? If you want to start a Dunkin' Donuts franchise, do you know what you need? You need $500,000 net worth, and you need $250,000 of liquid net worth. So you have to have $250,000 of cash just sitting there. And then they will allow you to start a Dunkin' Donuts. How many upstarts have that? How many upstarts have that ability to do that? And so the traditional development pattern provided our ability, and you know, in the early 1900s, it wasn't widespread across the country. I think that, you know, today our ethics as people, the way we view each other has changed, and we broadened that sense of who can participate. And that's a really important part of progressing as humanity. Yet that system of allowing people to start with nothing and build to something and pass that something on to someone else has been stolen from us in this system we've adopted. And if we could go back to the original system, not give up the modernity, not give up our current ethics, not give up who we are, but actually go back to that economic system of growth, we'd find that we may not hit the rapid highs of, you know, maximum GDP growth, but what we would do is we would have growth that could be sustained over time, would be more widespread, and would be more viable and could be passed on as real wealth to the next generation. And I think that's like a critical part of what's missing today. If you listen to our national politics, I mean, who in here doesn't think that our national politics has gone crazy, right? It's gone crazy, whether you're this side or this side, right? You're looking at this going, this is nutty, this is nutty. There's a model of nutty that we can look at, and I know I'm the guy who is making everybody depressed today, but there's a model of nutty you can look at, and that's 1930s Germany, right? Where you had an economic system that changed drastically after the First World War. People, you know, you had the hyperinflation episode, you had normal everyday people who were disenfranchised by the economic system put in place. And basically, as things got crazier and crazier, they were offered two far distant choices. They were offered, you know, the Soviet communism, and they were offered fascism. And essentially, those were both like horrible choices, right? But they crowded out everything else. I fear in this country that we're crowding out really good choices. And we can start to push back on that at the local level by not engaging in this system anymore and by changing our economics so that at the local level, we're incremental over a broad area over a long period of time. I realize that's a very idealistic vision. But it's one we could actually do if we wanted to. We don't have to participate in that craziness.
Chuck and I have a lot of fun times together. And we were in Santa Rosa. We had just seen The Big Short, which I'd highly recommend everyone watches this movie. Because we feel like we see the same things.
Tell them the scene about the where the guys, like, everybody's in an Enya video.
Oh, yeah.
That was like the best. We looked at each other and like, oh my gosh, that's what our life is like.
That we're witnessing, and part of what we illuminate is some of the sleepwalking that we have through our own cities and through our own lives. That these policies that we have a special knack for illuminating. One time that I said to an audience, I said, look, let me make it real simple for you all. The more land I consume in your community, and the crappier the building I give you, the lower you're going to charge me in taxes. That's it. That's the magic of our tax system. We go to awfully nerdy conferences together. One conference we went to together was the International Association of Assessing Officers Conference. This is the assessors, folks.
You're the life of the party.
Yeah, it makes the APA conference look like a Burning Man or something. It's like, it's the squarest conference ever. I mean, are there assessors in the room? Any assessors? I mean, seriously, go chat with your assessor. These are not the life of the party type of people, and that's just who they are. They're like the turtles of government. They have like this hard shell around them. They're used to being argued with. But this was an entire conference where they're debating tax assessment policy. And of course, we were there to spoil the party. But the head of Walmart's real estate was there, Mr. Terrell. And he got up and did this amazing presentation showing spreadsheets about how cheap his Walmarts were. He's showing spreadsheet after spreadsheet, and he's just belted into the crowd. He's like, if you think that we beat up Procter & Gamble, you need to see what we do to our general contractors. We make the cheapest buildings possible. And he started handing out business cards and said, please call me. We will share with you our spreadsheets about how cheap our buildings are. Now, I'm in the back of the room going, oh my God, this is brilliant. He's getting all of his taxes dropped in one meeting for the entire country. And now when JT and I and Josh, when we go through different communities, we essentially see the same value for Walmart in every damn community we go to. And this is the essence of their business model. So as a citizen who has a couple Walmarts in his community, I'm hearing our taxes are going to be the cheapest possible in your community. Like, as a citizen, my heart's breaking. So I couldn't help myself. I go up to the microphone and I asked him, I said, Mr. Terrell, what's the useful life of one of your buildings? He said, 15 years. We'll be out of that building in 15 years, maybe 20, because we want to start the depreciation cycle as quickly as possible. We're all about the transportation and infrastructure network and making sure that we have the distribution system, but we want to make cheap buildings. From the mouth of babes. This is your community. It's 300 years old. You've been bequeathed a wonderful environment. And you can make these decisions. You know, I'm having sweet tea. I had probably food that wasn't good for me last night, but I have to exercise. So there is a cost to this. If you need this Walmart, great, but what are you transferring? We did a project in Colorado, and they were so happy that they got a Walmart. And in Colorado, the cities are run off retail taxes. And they said, we've got a Walmart. Now we've arrived. And I said to them, I said, did you not have the ability to buy toilet paper or jeans before Walmart showed up? I mean, how'd you guys get by for the last 100 years? And it's, you know, again, there are these heuristics, these rules of thumbs, the way that we think the world operates. But really what we're doing, if another book to recommend is Moneyball. You know, Moneyball starts with Michael Lewis talking about baseball. And he said, baseball is a $17 billion a year industry, and no one uses math. $17 billion for all of baseball. My town is worth $12 billion. Your town's probably somewhere in the 40 billion range. Are you guys using math? You know, this is all stuff that's hiding in plain sight that we talk about. Sorry for the downer. But just realize that about the Walmart. It's not about hating the player. It's not about hating Walmart. It's about hating the game. The game needs to change, and the game is what you all can control.
All right, you guys are so smart. Why did the Egyptians build pyramids to last? Was that a good economical decision? And then I want to go through Rome, Athens, Greece, London, England, Paris, France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Were those good decisions at the time, or were they bad decisions?
Rome is still there. London is still there. Paris is still there. Yeah, so these places are still there. As far as the pyramids, well, those were essentially, you know, those were monuments to death. But I mean, Chuck should tell you a story about another pyramid. Memphis built a pyramid.
Well, I think you have to I'm not suggesting that every city that was ever built is fantastic, and that they did, they knew, because the pyramids were an investment in vanity, and you enslaved large parts of your population, and you forced them to build things to your own glory, because that was how you dominated the system, the economic system of those times. The economic system of antiquity was all about exploitation. That still doesn't change the fact that the cities they built were pretty darn resilient, right? And last a long time. We can have an economic system not based on exploitation that can also build like enduring cities. The Memphis Pyramid is a fantastic example, and I think this is a good segue to a more positive conversation about how we make like really good investments. So first the bad. How many of you have ever been to Memphis? Seen their pyramid? Okay. In the 1980s, Memphis figured, because this is what cities figured, that what they needed to be like a world-class competitive city, they were struggling in all these categories, really not doing well, a high homicide rate, high poverty rates. What they decided they needed was an NBA basketball team playing in a pyramid-shaped stadium down on the Mississippi River. So they went and built a pyramid-shaped stadium, And then they went searching for a basketball team. They were able to get the Memphis Grizzlies to move to Memphis. The problem is, when the Grizzlies got there, they didn't like the stadium. And so Memphis wound up building them a new stadium a few blocks away. That pyramid sat empty for about 15 years. One of these big will build it, and then there'll be all this development around it, and it'll create jobs and growth. These are the lies we tell ourselves. This is the model we live in. Let's pour some gas on this fire and try to get it going. It took them $200+ million of subsidy from the state and the local, this is decades after they built this thing, to get it redone and open now last year as a Bass Pro Shop. So they have the largest Bass Pro destination in this pyramid on the river. They still are not getting economic development around it. They're still not getting anything else happening, but now they don't have a dead building. They're talking about spending literally hundreds of millions more to connect it to the surrounding neighborhoods and try to get some more development going. I like to bring this up because I contrast it with this little neighborhood in Memphis. This little street called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue used to be a streetcar stop. 2 blocks. Streetcar would stop there. There's 2 blocks of commercial, residential above. In the 1950s, they ripped out the streetcars. They put a highway right through the middle of this neighborhood. That was what we thought would work back then. And when they did that, this streetcar stop just died. No foot traffic from the neighborhood, no people getting off on a streetcar. Those commercial buildings just died. Some residents were fed up with the decline. They were fed up with the neglect. They went out there. They worked with the owners of those buildings to get them swept out. They swept up the sidewalks. They took paint and they painted their own crosswalks and they painted their own bike lanes, and they put a little mural on the wall. And then they decided that for one weekend, we're going to invite businesses to come in here and open up on a temporary basis. And we're going to let the whole neighborhood know, and we're going to invite people to come here and experience what this street could be like. They had a bike shop come, they had an art gallery, they had a clothier, they had a couple little restaurants that opened up. They didn't go get Department of Health permission or inspections or any of that. They just did it, and they said, by the time anybody gets mad at us, we're going to be gone and whatever, right? I wasn't out there for this thing, but I saw pictures, and it looked like they were having a fun time. I was out there 6 months later. When I was out there 6 months later, every single storefront was full by a full rent-paying business. One of the landlords I was able to talk to for a while, he said he was able to charge double the amount of rent for the last thing to rent than what he was asking before the project. The city has gone out and documented 18 new businesses, 32 new jobs, $12 million of property value appreciation. A total public investment of zero. Zero. This is what we call chaotic but smart. It's that bottom up, it's that incremental development pattern. And when we step back and look at the way that our government systems are designed, the way that our federal and state funding systems are designed, the way that our cities are set up in silos and hierarchical bureaucracies, what we see is that we're set up right now to chase the dollar out on the edge, to be really aggressive with it, right? And to make massive, massive transformational investments in our core neighborhood. So we can build a $40 million parking ramp underground, right? But we don't have the money to fix a sidewalk or change a curb radius or put in a crosswalk. Here's the catch. Those huge investments, they're negative yielding. We actually lose money on them. When we make the small investments, what we see is that we don't risk hardly anything, and we make multiple sums back. Those are the things that make us rich. I like to point out, we've been chasing the dollar out on the edge, and what we've overlooked is the pennies and the nickels and the dimes just waiting to be picked up in our neighborhoods. If we go out into our city and we ask one question, where are people struggling? And if we answer that question and then say, what is the smallest, most immediate way we can address that struggle? What we find is that our answers become very small, very incremental, very tactical, and extremely doable. And they actually improve people's lives and build wealth. That's really hard to do Because our bureaucracies are not used to doing that. They're not used to going out and asking where our people struggle, observing people, finding, the ways to make people's lives better in a small incremental way. They're used to working in big things, big projects, public hearings, big large of money, big grant funds, big tax increment subsidies. When we actually get back to small, what we see is that we can make hugely valuable investments. Think of your own investment portfolio. Would you go buy one internet stock and put everything you had into that? No, what you do is you get a broad cross-section of all these little things, right? And some of them will do well, some of them won't. The ones that don't are made up for the ones that do. We need to do the same thing for cities. We literally need to do the same thing. That's going to require us culturally to think differently. It's also going to require us to retool our government. It's also going to require us to have a different relationship with the state and federal government in terms of what they want to fund and how they want to fund it.
Dicky, we're talking about building a cultural arts center. City money, probably state money. Would we really be better off if we took to heart what Chuck has said, and let's just let it grow organically with a whole lot of small art galleries, craft shops, music, whatever, as opposed to making such a large city government investment?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. But one of the things that seems to me is we need possibly both. It's great to have the neighborhood items and the core things that work within an area and can draw people because they want to come see the art and they want to see things that are going on. But being able to have a public facility that offers a certain amount of space for children's plays and activities and trainings and teachings and things of that nature, I think, are really important. One of the questions becomes, though, how do you really select locations? How do you determine where it should be? Do you make a decision that a cultural arts center should go on a piece of property strictly because the city already controls it? Is it necessarily the right place? I mean, I think there are a lot of questions that have to be answered about things of that nature. And I do think that very often government in particular makes bad decisions, and that may be one of them.
If you were going to start a college in Savannah, where would you put it?
I don't know where I would put it, but I know one thing. I'd call Paula Wallace and let her do it for me.
And think about what you just said. Well, because adaptive reuse of buildings, Massey School I went to, Massey School's almost 200 years old.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And it's spread out all over town. It's not just one place.
No, I was going to shake your hand.
But I think that the truth is that there's no question that what Savannah College of Art and Design has done for the community has been remarkable because they have taken the entire historic district and beyond and made it their campus.
And beyond.
And
when
beyond.
You get out on Montgomery Street and you see what's happened to the Neil Blund building. And that old warehouse that's now the Gulfstream building.
Taking buildings
Why
that
wouldn't
nobody
you do
would
the
do.
same? I'm going to argue with you. Why wouldn't you do the same thing for cultural arts? I mean, we've got house museums around town. We've got art galleries. Why put it all in the same place?
Go ahead.
I'm going to give you the trajectory of the College of Art and Design. Because what they did was brilliant, and I found it so fascinating to walk around last night and see where they are and how they're embedded in the community in all these places. But if you project out a crazy amount of time, 60 years, 100 years, what do? At some point, they get to the point where we're very successful. We've got a lot of wealth that we built up. We own all these places. There's a higher and better use for this place we got over here that was a hole in the wall 50 years ago. But now it's, someone's going to pay a big money for it. Someone's going to, and what they're going to do is they will wind up with a big facility somewhere. and maybe a few remote, but not as much as they do now. And so what they're doing is they're incrementally building wealth to the point where they're going to someday have, the big, huge thing that our normal sense is you start out with. They're actually building up to that. And that's what it looks like to me. Now, that might not be their plan right now, but as the economics of the place goes, they are one of the largest property owners. And all that property is going to become wealthier. And at some point, it's going to make more sense for their endowment, for everything that they're doing, to sell most of those and put themselves in key strategic spots. If I'm thinking of an art gallery for the city, or performing art, or whatever it is, I don't start with the end and say, where is this going to go? My hometown, we have a big courthouse. What did they do? You go back to the early 1900s, they knew this is where they wanted the courthouse to be. So everything they put in that block was temporary. And they built a small courthouse over here, and they built up to that one. And then they built the big one with the Roman columns out front. I think if you're doing an art gallery, that's how you do it. You make it work with what you've got today, you build it up, and at some point you do have the nice big facility, but you don't start with the end.
Why ever have the big facility? I still don't understand.
In today's context, you might not. But at some point in the future, it will make more. I'm just saying, for the College of Art and Design, at some point in the future, it will probably make more sense to divest of some of the properties they have that are really valuable and put that money into renovating one of the other ones.
But isn't that likely to happen one stroke of the pen at a time and not a massive stroke?
Yes. It's likely to happen iteratively over time.
Yeah, and what that does is that allows incrementally people to make building by building decisions.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're saying the same thing.
Agreed.
I'm talking on a long time frame. I'm not saying that at some point they're going to abandon the city and go down to one building and have a bunch of vacant ones. At some point they're going to say, we own 50 properties in the city, maybe we should own 40 and take the wealth from that 10 and put that into making the 40 really awesome. And you know what? That will create 10 opportunities for people to do fantastic things. That's incremental growth. That's the way cities grow and become prosperous and wealthy and successful. So to me, they're like the yeast in your bread, in ways that are wealth creating, but also in social, cultural ways as well. They're the yeast that is kind of, making this city rise in many ways.
That's their DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah. Che Gongware, I see you nodding away in the affirmative. So you obviously have some things to say or questions to ask. What do you think about all this? You were nodding away when maybe in disagreement with me, but that's okay.
I have a lot of agreement, but there is one question one statement that Joe made that nobody has spoken to. That is, you said tourism doesn't go to a place that has lost its soul. And I think there's some concern that we may be getting there. I think there's just on one street, Bay Street, there's 16 hotels. There are a number all over downtown. There are 9 more that are about to go up.
There's
12.
12.
There's 12 more.
Yeah, this is a. I wish I could call it a debate that we're having in Asheville. It's more like a mud fight. I've got friends that, a lot of the work that we do, I obviously don't dress like this in Asheville. And the work that we do in development in downtown Asheville, all the data that you see here was because we were trying to talk to people in our own community. I'd be at cocktail parties with, I guess beer parties is what we call them, but I'd be at parties with friends, and I'd tell them I work in real estate development, and they'd immediately follow with, "You're a scumbag." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And they're like, "All developers are scum." And I was like, "Okay. You go to our nightclub, yeah, you're still a scumbag." I'm like, "Okay, great, whatever. How about a thank you card?" It's just, and so a lot of it was just informing a community. We're currently going through the hotel thing. If you actually look at capital markets, There's sine curves that go through the system. Today it's hotels. The other sine curve moving through the system is housing. Back in the boom, it was condos. Now we're in apartments. It's just money moving through the system. The hotels are gambling on that right now. The capital is there for it. Your tourism numbers are showing that there's room for that. Same in Asheville. There's two ways of looking at it in Asheville. Some people say that tourism is the gateway drug to moving to Asheville, and it's kind of true. A lot of people come to Asheville, they're like, oh, this is so wonderful. Then they show up and just move their lives there. Well, you have an example right here. Was it bad to have a tourist show up in your town? Well, he's obviously found a place for himself here. And he doesn't have horns growing out of his head, and he hasn't bitten any small children, but not yet. But Asheville in 1929 had 19 hotels in the downtown. We have 4 right now, and there's plans for 6. You would think that the sky is falling and the world is going to collapse because we have 6 more hotels, which is more than what we have right now. And when I talk to people, they're completely irrational about the conversation because they're looking at today and saying, well, if we double the hotels, the world is certainly going to die. Well, what's going to happen is we're going to cannibalize the hotels that people are currently going to that are in much worse environments than our downtown. There's the Aloft Hotel. Our firm was part of that. I wish it was better architecturally, but I didn't have a say on that. But talking to the hotel operator, people go there, park there, and never leave. They leave their car there the whole time because the hotel has to pay the city for the cars being parked there. And they keep very good detail on that. So from a citizen perspective, if I've got somebody coming into my town with holes in the bottom of their pocket, just leaving money all over the place for me, that's awesome. I've got 70 restaurants downtown. I can't eat at all 70 of them. So thank you all for coming to Asheville and drinking our beer and eating our food. It actually makes our lifestyle so much better and richer for a town of 90,000 people. And that's the trade-off. Thomas Wolfe in Look Homeward Angel, and seriously, I think is a town that's, you're in a tourism economy, whether you like it or not. Read Look Homeward Angel. He complains, bitches and moans about tourists through the entire book, even though his mom runs essentially a glorified Airbnb. His mom bought up a bunch of houses, and basically they're boarding houses for people coming from Savannah and Charleston, and his brothers are sleeping with all of them in the hotel in the house. So it's like that's the essence of the book. It's fascinating to read. Not much has changed in Asheville, by the way, but I think is tourism going to affect your economy? Is it going to change your place? Yes. Well, why don't you make more place? It's just we talked about this last night. You're losing one street. It's turning into almost like a version of King Street in Charleston. It's your Urban Outfitters, Abercrombie and Fitch, and whatever. I mean, we're getting that now in Asheville. Is that? Do we shop there? No. In Asheville, we write articles about the effect of the local dollar. We have a local business group, support group. I was on the board of that to support local business. But we don't adopt any law that says no Abercrombie and Fitch, and it's just kind of how we deal with it.
Joe, why are you? I was going to just ask. Well,
I was going to ask Joe. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask Joe because I think there's an element of Asheville that is also relevant to discussions in Savannah a lot. And I think Asheville is a community that a lot of people look to and say, you have done as good a job as anyone at developing locally owned small businesses. And if you walk around the community, it's obvious. So I wonder if you could just take a minute and talk about some of, what went into that. That was obviously a proactive effort on your part, on your firm's part, and many others, and talk a little bit about how that culture evolved.
For our firm, we have a term, we call it growing your own. We had that earmark. Pat Whalen is Julian's trustee who's my boss. We were all on boards and committees in and around the community, so we'd hear of people that wanted to start a business. Some of the businesses were absolutely crazy, but a lot of the businesses made sense. It was just providing that opportunity for somebody with that first vegetarian restaurant. Now, because we were in Asheville, because we knew people that were vegetarians, it didn't seem like that big a risk. Also, they had a little food counter in the YMCA. So this is the anti-fragile that Chuck talks about, which is just you find something that can be resilient and flexible. So we invested in Joe and Joan Eckert to create the Laughing Seed. That was the first vegetarian restaurant in Asheville, and Asheville is now one of the top 10 vegetarian cities in the entire country. And it's not that we were like, could see the future. It was just making a small investment that was low risk, and we knew the people, and they make good food. But also Asheville was blessed with, and what you all are blessed with, all of these small spaces. So Asheville was off the radar screen for Gap and Banana Republic because we just don't have 5,000 square foot floor plates. We also use guilt like a weapon in our town. So everybody knows everybody, and it's just like if you rented out your property to Banana Republic, you'd probably catch some passive aggressive statements from time to time. It's just that's just how we roll in Asheville. But we're at the same tipping point. We're trying to have the same conversation, and when I go home, I try to bring some sane data to the conversation, but it's not always successful.
Would I be fair to say that as we walked around yesterday, you and me and JT, as we walked around, we're like, oh my gosh, gorgeous building, beautiful building, and then, disappointment. What is this? Oh, it's a hotel.
Yeah, there's things like your hotel is all the way across from City Hall, just why the lobbies are on the ground floor. And that was like, and we were coming from Abe's on Lincoln to the cotton sale. And as we were walking down the street, it was like, what a disappointment. There's a lobby. You can see the glass. There's not a soul in the lobby. And it's just dead, dead, dead. And then Chuck goes, and here you go. Turning radius, porte cochere thing.
Yeah, the parking.
So there, you have, there are some simple rules that, now that building, a lot of the housing that's in downtown Asheville were old hotels. So they could be adaptively reused. That hotel, for as bad as the ground environment is, can actually be reused. You just have to wait, but you have to suffer through that environment. So have some basic standards. One of the statements that Chuck usually makes in his presentation, he didn't make today, is he shows Brainerd, and we'll go ahead and we'll just say Savannah and say this. So when Savannah was laid out for all this beautiful stuff that you all celebrate, that you put on postcards, who was the planning director? How thick was your zoning code? Did he review every building that went up? Did he say this is where your door needs to be? Was he the architectural review committee? Did they beat up every property owner for about a month before they opened the building? So I think that's one of the, back to Chuck's point about hubris, that's something that we need to realize is that these buildings that come in, and I'm saying this I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth, because these businesses that come in, like the Hampton Inn or whatever, they're coming in with a nationalized model, and they're just trying to shoehorn it into your small blocks. And they do need to work on your terms because this is your community, and I would obsess over the ground floor of those. But some are better than others.
Yeah, let me just speak about tourism and hotels for just a second, because I think it's a two-edged sword. The city of Savannah made decisions years ago, whether right or wrong, that it wanted a large entertainment district, and it focused on bringing hotels in. We have a lot of hotels and a lot more coming. And even though there are negatives to it, there are the positives. There are lots of retail opportunities now. There are lots of restaurants. I'm not sitting here and saying we need more hotels. That's not the point at all. What I do agree with is that we need courage, we need proper zoning, and we need to follow rules we have. I'll give an example, and it's the hotel that'll be built on the west end of River Street soon. It's not a matter whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not going to get into that. But it's being built on property that was zoned to allow only 2 stories. It is going to be as much as 5 stories. And, you have to question when citizens and government spend time and money trying to determine what is good zoning, what's right for growth in the community, how fast they make changes to those decisions can be very detrimental. And so that's one of the things that concerns me is that it's the not setting rules and sticking to them.
Let me just say one thing about the hotels. If you have 11 or 13 or 19 or however many hotels you're coming in, essentially that should be signaling something to you, right? Like people want to open hotels here. I think the question is not, how do we accommodate 19 hotels? The question is, how do we remain who we are and what is successful and works for us amidst market pressure for 19 hotels? And if that means you ultimately wind up with 8 hotels or 6 hotels, but they fit you perfectly, you in terms of like your core downtown, you're not desperate today. You're not desperate. This place works really well. It's creating an enormous amount of wealth for you. The desperation in your community is elsewhere. It's not there. So you're not sitting here from a position of weakness going, please, we need you, it's so horrible. You know, you're from a strong position of strength, and you can essentially dictate how you want this to go down in a way that is the most beneficial for you. I think the second thing, hotels, like Joe said, early Asheville had tons of hotels. Cities had tons of, people had hotels and they were all over and they fit in, and sometimes it was just one floor, and it was all this kind of stuff that we don't do today because we deal in big chunks today. But I think the way we start to get back to incremental is through parking. And if I were like to magically do one thing in Savannah, I would say this. I would not build a single new parking spot in your core downtown. Zero. And that will be heretical to so many people. But I would say, here's the parking we have. We will never have more parking than this. How do we make a city work with this much parking? And if you actually started with that, what you would see is that the outcome would be a lot more like really great stuff, a lot less, demand for parking, and actually I think your development model would flow more smoothly. The future would be revealed to you a lot clearer and a lot better than if you have this like jerkiness where you're like, okay, we're adding 40 hotel units, so that means we have to have 85 parking spots, so that means we've got to do like ridiculous things about parking. No, start and say, here's the parking we have, here's all we're ever going to have. How do we manage this in the best, how do we create a development pattern with that limitation? And I think if you do that, you will reach like a nirvana in terms of the place you are. And Kevin might disagree with me, I'm not putting words in his mouth because we never spoke about this, but to me, that's what I would start with. And I think that would shape your entire hotel conversation.
Actually, I think it is a compelling way to think about it. And in fact, one of the things that I remember writing about sometime years ago, when we think about this whole world of sort of transportation spending and planning and everything else, we almost never stop and ask ourselves the question, what if we did nothing?
Right.
So we assume, that, for example, an interstate needs to be expanded, and we just have to spend the money. And we do that because we find ways to find the money to do it, but we almost never stop and ask ourselves, well, what if we didn't have that money? And if we really couldn't do anything at all, what would happen as a result? Does that mean, the world would, come to an end? Would people change their own patterns of how they get around or where they live? And it's interesting to me because, that is like a foundational question. When you assume you have the resources to do it, then you generally just go do it. But if you don't have the resources and you have to stop and think about the alternatives, then it leads to a whole different set of questions.
Real quick, Kevin, in Savannah, most people are familiar with the Truman Parkway. Mm-hmm. And the Truman Parkway is one of our super highways through the city. And when I was 13 years old, they were going to build the Casey Canal Parkway, which was exactly the same roadway that we have today. It took them 50 years to get to the time where they did it. And would we have been better off as a community if we had built it earlier, both in growth potential and financially? So I think sometimes, from my perspective, yes, doing nothing can be good, but it also can be a really bad thing to do. And I think that as we're talking here today, that we're talking a lot just in theory and not the specifics. And if it's all right, I would love to open it up to the floor for questions, particularly for our two speakers.
Let's move a little beyond the downtown, and I think you suggested that, and also talk about adaptive reuse. We've currently been looking at a building so many of us love, that because developers have come in with the same old idea to assemble and build, we, I guess, are about to lose an important building. Whereas you're talking about vision and courage, if only we could make that a part of the development, it might well be much, much more valuable and more attractive for all the other businesses. And then I talked to a council member and said, okay, tell me why we couldn't do this and that. And his response was, look, I'm all for property rights. We don't mess with that. And if you don't understand that, I cannot explain it to you. Well, I think I'm a little taken aback, and I'm wondering, on the one side, you have the old paradigm of assembling and building and cookie cuttering and franchising and so on, and making it any place USA. On the other, we want to have courage and vision and adaptive use. So how do we talk to each other in a more sensible, productive way?
I'm going to let the panelists speak to that, but just as a local Savannian, I'd like to address it. I think one of the real issues is that we have Historic Savannah Foundation, which does a wonderful job. We have created new historic districts beyond the largest national landmark district in North America. But at the same time, we have not taken the time to go out into other neighborhoods and look at what buildings need to be saved. And from my perspective, I'm trying to look at it from both sides. And one side that I see it is, I hate that Johnny Harris is going to be torn down. Let's just go ahead and put it in the room rather than talk about a building. But at the same time, there is not a zoning ordinance that says it can't be torn down. There is not any protection on it on the historical level. It's not certified in any way, shape, or form. Whether it should have been is not the question. It's the reality of the moment. Yes, it's going to be a shame when that building's torn down, but at the same time, if you don't have the legal right to stop it, then you have to go along with it. But I think it's a chance for us to open our eyes to what we want for other areas of Savannah. And it's an opportunity for us to go ahead and do a survey on Victory Drive, and a survey in Ardsley Park, and a survey in the Victorian districts, and see which buildings need to be protected and do something about it. And my last comment is that when I've been listening to Joe and Chuck talk, a lot of what they have said is that, you know, we can prevent these things from happening. The problem is that in almost every community, we don't. So it's a lot of apathy, a lot of the facts that we don't take a position until it's too late. So I hope that this will open the eyes of a lot of us in the community to start looking forward to protecting neighborhoods and buildings that need it.
And I want to build off that. There's I'm trying to Google what the building looks like. You know, it's trained as an architect. There's good architecture and bad architecture. There's buildings that are worth saving. There's buildings that aren't. There's buildings that, in my slideshow, when I showed the 1800s Asheville and I said 15 years later this is what happened, part of the reason why those two slides are in there, and Chuck's got a similar iteration in his, we basically have them for two different reasons. My reason is that in Asheville, I have peers, friends, colleagues, neighbors that treat it like a curatorial museum. Like it's done, it's trapped in time, it's never going to change. Any new building is an offense to downtown. which is unfortunate because what I argue is let's go back to 1800s Asheville. I don't care about these brick and stone buildings. I want the wooden ones back, the real Asheville, right? So what's our role in choosing what time is relevant in our community? Now that's deeply offensive to a lot of people that are historic preservationists. Even though our firm preserved a lot of buildings, we won a lot of preservation awards. We do that to be provocative, to just get past is the building of merit. And I'm still waiting for a picture to show up, but you know, if it is of merit, if it is of historic character, if it passes that muster, then yeah, you should have the conversation about what's our battle line. You know, in Asheville, the thing that's frustrating to me is that we are stuck on this hotel thing, and my big beef is that we've got 12 acres of land in our downtown that the city's using for a police impound lot and garbage trucks. And, you know, pardon my anger, but I'm just like, why the hell aren't we talking about affordable housing? And the city can solve that problem just by releasing that land right now and discounting the cost of the land and having our affordable housing needs taken care of with 2,000 units of housing in our downtown at 5 stories. Why the hell aren't we doing that? Why are we having this navel-gazing conversation about hotels? So our community gets into these traps of what they think is important and is worth the community discourse, and we miss everything else around it. So in our downtown, it's illegal to have design guidelines. Our state does not allow my state, anyone in my state, to have design guidelines. That's illegal. We're also not allowed to have impact fees. There's so many. Our hands are tied in North Carolina in ways that you could only imagine. Oh, that's pretty cool.
So,
well, hang on. So
yeah, go ahead.
If you go north of downtown on Merriman, there's a Staples building that is god-awful. And because we weren't having a discussion about urban design guidelines, this building got built and got labeled as an urban building. There is a sheer wall against the sidewalk of close to 20 feet. And so it tainted the conversation about urbanism because people thought, well, if the building's close to the street, it's urban. Well, you kind of need a door to get in it, you know? And so we changed the conversation from rather than all urban buildings are bad to should we at least have a policy about doors on the street? You know, so this may be a tipping point for you all. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something, unfortunately. In Asheville, the turning point for Asheville was there was a proposal to do a downtown mall in the 80s to rip down 6 square blocks of downtown. That was a tipping point for us saving the downtown. And the mayor at the time, Mayor Lou Bissett, 25 years later, would say at a State of the Downtown address that he's like, I'd never thought I'd say the day that I was wrong on this because I harbored a grudge for a long time once we lost that battle. He was actually in favor of the mall. But it would take 25 years for him to have the grace and humility to say, I was wrong and we did save something well here. But that was a battle that we had to go through.
The implications of my first talk today for a city like Savannah are hard to grasp, but they're really important. You can kind of put Savannah into 3 economic boxes. One is the part of the community that is generating more wealth and taxes than it's costing in services. And I'm telling you, Joe and I have done this all over the country, and Lafayette is probably the best example. Those are not necessarily the rich neighborhoods. A lot of times those are the poorest neighborhoods. But they're the neighborhoods built in a kind of traditional style. And you can look on a map, and if I had to just like spitball where those are, you know, it's pretty easy to see those kind of neighborhoods here. You then have the rest of the city, which is either being propped up by the wealth coming from the core, or are early enough in the life cycle where they're still in that illusion of wealth phase. Okay? So I looked at the map, I saw where this restaurant is. It's right by the interchange. You've got the mall there, you've got the Chipotle and the Whole Foods. And these are all areas that long-term are not financially viable. And so the question in these parts of your town become, how much of this do we want to prop up? How much of it is salvageable? And under, you know, what conditions would we do that? And the fear that I see, or the reaction that I see, and Kevin and I have chatted about this and share a lot of interests, similar viewpoints on what is often called suburban retrofit or sprawl repair. There's some really brilliant people working on this stuff, but financially, none of it pencils out. Because, we'll take the Whole Foods when it's no longer a Whole Foods, and we'll rip a street, we'll rip out the middle and try to make it a street with frontage, and then put apartments on the second floor and a little village next to it. And you're like, okay, well, that's really cute and nice, but then you see, like, the pro formas, you need $40 million, and half of that has to be public subsidy. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense anymore. But our bureaucracies tend to like those because they're large increments. I think our challenge is to look at these neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are salvageable but not viable today, and say, how do we start making small investments there? How do we make small improvements to get them on that incremental pattern up? Because the development pattern that's going to get us to solvent and viable in those areas is not going to involve huge changes and large transactions. It's going to involve a lot of little things over a broad area over a long period of time. And I think that humility thing kicks in again because we really don't know of this wide swath of America and a wide swath of a city like Savannah that really long-term is not financially viable. What parts will work and what parts won't? We really don't know until time plays it out. But we can seed that and nurture it by dedicating ourselves to those small little investments. And by those things, I mean things like going out and saying, okay, a lot of people are trying to cross the street here. Let's narrow up the street and put in a crosswalk. A lot of people are trying to get from here to here. They're walking through the ditch. Let's actually put in a sidewalk here. Those are like small investments that actually improve people's lives and make those neighborhoods a little bit more viable and allow them to incrementally grow and improve, and they don't cost a ton of money. When we go in and say we're going to take one big site and redo it and renovate it, and we're working at the wrong increment. Oh, please.
I think about half of what you said, and I will tell you that I totally agree that a lot of things that are happening on Victory Drive are a shame. As I mentioned earlier, I was born in Savannah. I'm a native Savannian, and I grew up in that area. And one of the things that's happened, obviously, as we all are aware, is traffic patterns. Not only do we have an extraordinarily large amount of traffic on Victory Drive, but we now have the Truman Parkway dumping off there, which put a lot of pressure on from the developers to say, there are people there, we want to be able to take advantage of it. And unfortunately, zoning was allowed to change that did take away neighborhoods, that did make a lot of changes. And I think it is important that we all start looking at those things and trying to protect the areas and neighborhoods that we want to see protected.
I wanted to shift just a minute. We haven't talked much about transportation this afternoon. Those of us on this side of the road have heard some ambient noise. We've heard children playing on the playground at Garrison Elementary and vehicles coming off the MLK, which is a stroad, And there were hundreds of people here today. I counted 7 bicycles here. Some of you may have walked, but the vast majority of people drove here today, even if they were coming from just on the other side of the street. So my friend whose daughter goes to Garrison, he wanted her to go to that school, but before she went there, he took her on the back of his bicycle to school and everything. Now we can't do that anymore. So we've got this much needed development happening on this side, but we've got a situation here that the moment we try to make things safer or make it easier to get across on a bike or a car, we will have howls of protest for people who will never get that extra 30 or 90 seconds of their life back if they have this thing going a little bit slower. So what the tipping point we're using, I guess it's maybe for Chuck, to address a stroke like this that really divides the community and makes it so at a very attractive school, no child can ever walk or ride their bike safely to that school.
Yeah, the schools are, I've heard the same sound too, and actually thought the same thing as we're sitting here. The tipping point tends to actually be when everything falls apart and you have to do something. And it tends to happen like, what's the money source? So if the money source to fix something comes from the state and the federal government, then it tends to get bigger and more violent, like I said earlier. If it comes locally, it tends to become smaller and smarter and more tactical. When you look at Savannah as a whole, an aggregate, you have parts of your community that are extremely wealthy. I was walking around last night looking at the home values, and I thought, there's no way I could live here. This is really expensive property, right? Yet when you step back and you look at the median household income of Savannah, it's not all that high, right? You don't have a lot of rich people here. If you want to do one thing to liberate people, allow them to live with one car, or allow them to live with no cars. And if you can do that, you're taking thousands of dollars that are being directed outside of your community and you're putting it in people's pockets. And if we can do that, and the school is a great example because you're talking about parents with kids from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. If you can bring your kid to school on a bike, if your kid can get to school by walking, all of a sudden you've changed the dynamic of that family's ability to take certain jobs, to be able to work, to be able to care for their kids, and for their family economics. You've dramatically changed it and reformed it. So I think if we have that mindset, if we are going to go out and get federal dollars and state dollars to do big transportation things, it should never be the thing that drives the solution. The solution should be driven by, do we want this to be a street or a road? And then we go out and find the funding way we make that happen. And for the most part, these are streets.
I want to add on to Chuck's comment and maybe help you down that path as well. One of the projects we did in High Point was what would happen if you did a road diet? What would happen, part of, Chuck and I present a lot together because transportation is intrinsically linked to real estate, and real estate is intrinsically tied to the transportation network, so that the value of real estate is gifted by the transportation system that's in front of it, or it can be penalized. So if the value of that real estate changes, you're going to get people that are going to complain, I can't drive through your neighborhood as fast as I used to. It's like, well, I'm sorry, we didn't want to be a kidney anymore, we're now a heart. So we're not about passing you through. If that's the way it's going to be, I'm going to drive through your neighborhood. It's basically owning what you have and saying we're going to stand up for ourselves, and we're going to say certain neighborhoods need to be protected from this pass-through traffic. But conversely, if you do the math on this of if the street changes, what happens to the dynamic of the real estate? You have real estate pressure in your downtown that's really valuable property, but that value can transfer actually in other neighborhoods as well. If somebody has no longer the need to have a car, that's $5,000 a year that you're talking what? That's like $30,000 more on their mortgage that they can afford. So the value of those houses can actually go up. The people that are of lower wage can still afford them. But you're yielding more tax base. And this, what did we do? It was like a 6-block area. In this 6-block area in High Point, North Carolina, the road diet would have yielded with the adjacent real estate and in the neighborhood around it, because the rising tide raises all boats. When the street goes up, the neighborhood around it realizes a bump in benefit as well. And it was $2.3 million over 20 years would have been the raise in value just in improving that neighborhood. So we asked them, we said, what would this road project cost? And they said $1.1 million. And so we asked them, would it be worth it investing $1.1 million to get $2.3 million return. Seems like a no-brainer to me. So it just gives your politicians some ammunition for when these people complain about having their lives inconvenienced by their 9 extra seconds that they have to drive through a neighborhood. You know, it's just, that's the thing, is people react in this visceral kind of, you saw that one guy's comment, it's not about where you live, it's about what you believe. They believe that they have a right to drive through your neighborhood as fast as possible. And that's the way that people think.
Just want to add 2 quick things onto that. You know, one of the most shocking statistics that I think I learned within the last 5 years was that the average American household spends 18% of its after-tax income on transportation. So that's 3 times what we spend on healthcare. So think about that for a minute and think about how many debates and discussions we have about healthcare and, you know, endless talking about how that impacts our own finances. And yet we spend 3 times that amount on transportation and we almost never really talk about it.
And that's massively subsidized.
That's right.
Because that's not counting the taxes we pay to build the system and maintain the system and all that.
Exactly.
That's just your out-of-pocket.
That's just for the
your
cars.
share of the
Yeah.
expenses.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And so if there's really, I think you're right, if there's any one real tremendous thing that you can do for people is to find a way to create communities that lower their own transportation costs. So if you can walk or bike or take public transportation and it gets you, you know, a fully middle-class lifestyle, that you've done a tremendous thing for people. Relative to this area, and again, I think what I said at the beginning, I'm really glad we're in this location because it really is on the front lines in many ways of planning and development in Savannah. And this is the part of sort of the larger downtown area where we really have lost the street grid. Some of that is due to the flyover that we talk a lot about. Some of that is due to the historical patterns of development that were here 100 years ago and a lot of railroad-oriented buildings and everything else. But as we are to expand downtown, especially this direction, it's absolutely critical that we find ways to reconnect that street grid and take the pressure off of Martin Luther King Boulevard to be the one street or the Strode that handles all of the traffic. West of Forsyth Park, there are only 2 streets that are north-south streets that go through from Bay Street to Gwinnett. And one of them is Barnard Street, which has, I think, 6 squares along it. The only other street is Martin Luther King Boulevard. And because of that, it creates a tremendous barrier for any kind of walkable or bike-friendly development this way. And the answer to that is partially about MLK and traffic calming it, but it's really more about the network and the whole street network and how we need to improve it on this side of downtown.
Absolutely.
Yes, as far as the hotels, I think due to the demand, the hotels should be used as to get a lot of other areas renovated. So to a lesser extent where they can make their return on investment, it blends in with the community, is that they move away from downtown sort of to the adjoining, say, metropolitan area where I live. You've got spaces there where you can have a walkable community by creating jobs in that community, which will lessen the demand for cars, and also everybody, it'll be a win-win situation, I think, rather than concentrating everything downtown. A little elephant in the room here. The soul of Savannah, from my perspective, what I read, Visit Savannah years ago, African Americans are the soul of Savannah. You don't see any African Americans here. You know, you're making decisions that are affecting the city, but the other part of Savannah is not included. What I would like to see, and I've been on SDRA for a while, since about 2000, worked with Dicky, Mr. Howard with Hungry Club, so I've been involved in a lot of communities. And I think there's a lot of dollars per acre value per acre, if you come down a little bit away from it, you can almost increase the value of the landmark district, the Victorian district, and then have a win-win situation for Savannah. So I feel that, you know, those hotels that are coming, there are 3 hotels on MLK, but they don't have an address on MLK. So now we need to change that mindset, and I think it would be wonderful for everybody.
I mean, I would agree with that. There's, I mean, in our, if we drilled into some of the maps, and I've done this with Chuck before, there's, in Lafayette, there's a section of town, the traditional African American neighborhood, that's pretty much not visible in the political conversation, in the meetings that we had. But one of the things that we spent and pointed out is that that's actually one of the more fertile, productive, financially producing gifts to the community. But in people's minds, it's been thought of as a low wealth neighborhood. And again, it's just trying to get past that bias and let the data show that. From a hotel perspective, you know, oftentimes they make the choice. They're going to come from another area and they're going to select a part of the city to be in. To some degree, there are ways that can be steered in conversations by site selection or by the redevelopment authority maybe taking the leadership position to kind of bring that parcel to the table. And again, I don't know this market well enough to know if the hotels are just coming in making a private transaction, then the next thing you know, you're having a hotel discussion. That's typically what happens in Asheville. For our hotel that we were a part of, that parcel that we owned was producing about $7,000 a year in total taxes. It's not even finished. It's a public-private partnership with a city deck, parking garage. We're building housing on it, and the hotel is the only thing that's done with the parking garage, and it produced $57,000 in taxes just to the city alone. So the city now has deeper coffers that they could, rather than move the hotel, what they can do is use that largesse that they get to make smaller investments over a broader area, because they've seen a tax raise of $50,000 a year coming out of that one building. But again, those are all conversations I'm not aware of. We're really not deciding anything here. This is more of a broadcast of just some ideas, and we've only been here a day or two. So, but
Other questions from the audience? Larry.
First of all, thank you all for being here, sharing your skill set in such a direct and opportunist manner. It's been a very effective exchange of sharing your ideas. I'd like to know if you can point out anywhere here in the Southeast where some of these ideas have been embraced by a community or a suburb or whatever that is in transition or has transitioned using the principles.
I'll start with a couple of examples. Chuck has some examples that he should share with you. He tracks this better than we do. I mean, Lafayette is probably the first one to kind of really dig deep. And it's like anything. Think of your budget. You're going to make conscious decisions about your finances when you're in your worst financial situation. So if I'm out of work, I'm probably going to reconsider a $5 a day latte habit, right? You know, it's like, I won't go out this weekend. You know, I won't eat a steak dinner. I mean, there's things that we do with our own finances, and we see this with cities. When cities are wealthy, they tend to be, pardon this, being curt about this, they tend to be stupid. You know, they do big projects, they do crazy things because they're not feeling the ramification. It's like being a 15-year-old. It's like, I'm invincible, you know, or a 20-year-old. I can, you know, do all sorts of crazy things. You know, it's like we were all like that. But we tend to see this more particularly in Florida and places that are rapid. Well, Gwinnett County. Gwinnett County was telling themselves that they were so wonderful for decades until you actually look at their data. And they don't really see the impending sacrifice. Gwinnett County chose to do nothing with that data. You know, that's their choice. Lafayette is going to think of a way to redo their budget, redo their financial structure, redo things, which is terribly unsexy to talk about. Like, who wants to talk about your municipal budget system and get into a 3-ring binder this thick that gets in all these spreadsheets? But that's what they're doing, and that programming is going to be different. So in Asheville, I wish we were a little bit more active on this stuff in Asheville, but Asheville is kind of a funky culture that way. But those are my experiences. But Chuck can tell you about some. I think Hayes, Kansas is, I think, my favorite example that he's found.
The Australia of Hayes, Kansas is this place in the middle of nowhere, and they're broke. And they started reading our stuff and said, oh my gosh, we need to do this. And they're actually retooling their entire city government. I've been out there and met with them and did a workshop with them to kind of just brainstorm and talk through how they do this. But they're changing their entire model of how they deliver services. I actually think the two most exciting places in the country right now in terms of experimenting with the stuff that we're talking about, and understand we've had, 2 generations plus of retooling to do things the way we're doing it now. So where we're seeing success are in these really odd situations where they're kind of on the fringes. But the 2 most exciting places to me are downtown Detroit and the core neighborhoods of Memphis. These are places where they're desperate enough and poor enough to actually say, we're going to think differently. We're going to throw out all this stuff that we've done, and we're actually going to be open to new things. So you see things like in Memphis, there's a building, the Tennessee Brewery building, which is this old brewery. It's a gorgeous building, like 8 stories tall, brick. They've struggled for years to have someone come in and use this building, and everything that they were going to do was going to require huge amounts of subsidies and this massive pro forma and all these housing units, even while they had vacancies and the housing units just up the block. It never worked. It never made sense. So they went out and they were going to demo the building and just have bare ground because they pay less taxes that way because they have a stupid property tax system. Instead, some people stepped forward and they said, we got an idea. Let's see if we can just get something going on the first floor. $500,000 is what they were going to sell this building for. Demo it, sell the land for $500,000. They, which was obscene because the land was worth nothing once the building's gone because there's so much vacant land. They went in, and over the course of it, so 3 months or 4 months, they, on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, had a brewery. They would just open up. They brought in a local brewer. They had kegs brought in, and they would just, with plastic cups, serve. They had a couple of food trucks come in. They set up like a ping pong table and a bunch of plastic chairs outside. They'd have a little bonfire. And for 3 nights a week, they'd have a little neighborhood bar out of this huge brewery building. They netted $300,000 over the course of those few months. Enough to actually put a down payment on the building, buy it, and now they're working on creating the first floor as a restaurant bar that would be open year round. They're not worried about the second floor, the third floor, the fourth. They're not worried about any of that. They're not doing traditional financing. They're not trying to get Wall Street involved. They're not trying to do secondary market stuff. They're bootstrapping it by just focusing on the first floor. And what it's doing is it's not only providing an opportunity in that building, and someday they will get the first floor working great. It's going to cash flow. What are they going to do then? They're going to go work on the second floor, and then they're going to work on the third floor, and pretty soon they're going to have all 8 floors developed, and they're going to be filthy rich, right? But the cool thing is that it's slowly part of the activation of the entire neighborhood. And you have an entire neighborhood, and this is adjacent to South Memphis too. In South Memphis, it's a viable business model to get in your car, drive to Walmart, fill up the back with toilet paper, and come back and sell it out the back of your car, because people are so poor that they don't own cars, and there's no retail places in that neighborhood. This is an extremely poor neighborhood. Yet, when we look at it with Joe's analysis, it actually is subsidizing the neighborhoods out on the edge, the wealthy neighborhoods. The poorer neighborhoods in Memphis are subsidizing the wealthier. And so the city has realized this and has seen, here's people bootstrapping a building. Here's a neighborhood that is actually, if we just forget the people that live there, ignore everything, these are neighborhoods that are good investments. Let's go out there and make life better for the people there. Let's try to seed some local retail. Let's actually put money into fixing the sidewalks and the streets. we owe it to these neighborhoods. They're paying more taxes than the rich neighborhood out on the edge. Let's do that. And so you're starting to see incremental innovation in places that have been desperate and overlooked for a long time. And I think that's a model that is worth studying and hopefully worth repeating in cities all over.
I think you're describing the place where you live. I want to talk about some areas on the west side. Someone mentioned that the growth in Savannah, my name is Bernetta Lanier, growth is going east and west. Well, I live in the area west of downtown that is, I coined a term about 12 years ago, and it's an urban. It's an urban.
Yep.
Because these neighborhoods grew up in the first concentric circle.
Right.
At the time when automobiles were coming online, at the end of the cars. So these neighborhoods have been here over 100 years. And we are 1 mile from downtown Savannah, in walking distance. There are actually 3 blocks between downtown Savannah and the west side of Savannah, West Savannah. And those 3 blocks have just become an enterprise zone. So after this development is done, I'm sure we want to look further west. Now, in the area that I'm referring to, the worst conditions in Savannah exist in this area. In my opinion, wherever there are the worst conditions, we have the most opportunity. So we have an opportunity right now to address the problems of this area, and Savannah could really be an international model for dealing with poverty. If we really just deal with the cultural issues that you were referring to and take a look at these areas. So there's a question, and my question is, how do the people of low wealth neighborhoods, and if you don't look at the people, where the property exists is rich. When you're talking right next to the ports and the river and downtown historic Savannah, in the middle of western Chatham, a growing area in the middle of all this vibrancy and this wealth, how do you get the people of a low wealth area to plan, to take advantage and to coexist and be sustainable with the growth that is happening in Savannah at this time?
I love that question. I'm the planner who doesn't believe in planning, just so we're clear. And I think like one of the worst things that we do is go do master plans, because master plans enable, they're bureaucracy enabling mechanisms. We like to work right now today in large increments. And when we look at neighborhoods that are struggling, generally we say, well, let's go out and plan some big improvement that will then trickle down to everybody in the neighborhood. And I think what we see, the example from Memphis is a really good one. These places are successful in many ways today that we don't tend to value the way that we should. And if we go out with humility and ask the question, where are people struggling? And try to, in the quickest, lightest, cheapest way possible, address that issue right now, today. And we do that day after day, week after week, month after month. What we see is that we can start to make these places better places to live for everybody. We can start to raise the wealth in those communities and make them more successful. And the best part of it is that that is wealth that stays with the people that are there. When we go in with the big model, we go in and say, okay, we've got a neighborhood that's struggling. Let's go in and build the big redevelopment place here and the 6-story condo with the attached retail. What happens is we wind up dislocating people. When we're successful, we wind up making it either too expensive to live there or simply just as part of the process, dislocating people out of the neighborhood. The trick of the incremental approach is to build wealth that actually resides in the neighborhood with the people who are there. That's how we empower communities intergenerationally. And so to me, I haven't been to this neighborhood. I would love to, and maybe we can yet today while we're here. I would love to see it, because the way you describe it sounds like the places that we see in cities like this that are like the next place. And if we approach the next place with an incremental mindset, respecting, with the humility to say, We're here to make life better for people here now. I think we can be like way more successful with what we're doing.
There's other examples of actually Vince is sitting at your table. From Charleston, they have a housing organization, Michelle Mapp, who does some amazing stuff. They have a great conference once a year, but they're very in tune to the housing pressures in their neighborhoods around the community as well. So much in the way that I use my parents and my grandparents in my PowerPoint, it's like you have other cities that have been through those pressures that have set up mechanisms to address these issues and to have that conversation. Just the conference that they have up there is just amazing. It's a broad, open conversation about housing issues in the community. But I would agree with Chuck that you start by talking to people there and build wealth in the community. I don't know enough to be articulate about it. There could be a barrier that's like a road that cuts the neighborhood off or other physical things. But oftentimes we find that do these people in these neighborhoods have access to buy their own house? Or is this predominantly vacant landlords that are just rent, and folks have no ability to actually become part of a community through ownership? And
we actually went out, and then I showed earlier the Taco John's and the Old and Blighted block. When I did that analysis, everybody at the city hall got mad at me. Everybody in the city got mad at me that had to do with it because you made them look kind of silly. And the question they came back to me with was, well, what would you have done, Chuck? And I said, well, that's a fair question. So I wrote a whole long thing about here's how I would approach this neighborhood, because it's not this block, it's the neighborhood. We've ripped out the sidewalks, we've widened out the streets, we've made it difficult to live there, we've forced everybody there to drive everywhere, which economically doesn't, when people do walk, it's really despotic. And I said, I would go out and try to nurture this neighborhood. And we actually had a foundation that came in and said, we want you to do this. Go out, here's a grant for a year, go out and try this. So we went out in the neighborhood, and we did go out and talk to people, but I think even more important than talking to people, we went out and observed. And we observed where people struggled. So we saw the mom walking through the ditch with the stroller, weeds up to her waist. Like, what in the world is going on? So we asked her, what are you doing? Well, I've got to get to the grocery store today. I don't have a car today. My husband has a car. He's at work. I don't have the car. I've got to get to the grocery store. It's not safe to walk on the road, so I'm walking here in the ditch. So the elderly woman walking with the walker down the middle of the street, climbing over snow mounds. What are you doing? I have to get to the pharmacy today. I don't have a choice. I can't drive. The sidewalk's not shoveled, and there's no sidewalk over here, so I have to walk out here. And at the end of this, we came up with a report. Neighborhoods First, we called it. 8 projects that we could do that we had gone out and tested out. We had painted our crosswalks. We had put in, narrower lane. We had done these things. 8 little projects the city could do to make this neighborhood a little more livable for the people that were there. Plant a row of trees here. Put in a crosswalk over here. Do some cross-hatching here to slow things down. The total cost of our project, $17,000. The city's right now spending $9 million to build an industrial park on the edge of town to try to create jobs and growth and economic opportunity for people. We said, let's just go in and spend small sums of money, like actually addressing the real problems that we see, trying to make lives better for people. And here's the cool thing. Like, I showed the city engineer, I'm like, look, there's a goat path through the ditch here. See, that's like worn, that's where people are walking. Where are they walking? They're walking from the neighborhood to the store. If we put a sidewalk in there, and then planted some trees so there's some shade, do you not think that this neighborhood would be more valuable and this store would be more successful? Yes, they would. Of course they would. Well, let's just iterate that over and over and over. Let's just do that again and again and again. And what you find is that when you get the easy stuff done, everybody's lives are a little bit better. Now it's the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step. And if we do that iteratively over and over and over, we're not only respecting the people that are there, right? But we're building wealth, and we're building wealth in a way that's going to bring everybody with us. That's my vision for what we do in all the communities that you've described.
Good response. Any other thoughts or questions from the audience? Denise.
I love your quote about tourists don't come to a city without a soul, and I would like to think that people don't want to live in a city without a soul as well. And I think for Savannah, the touristy area of Savannah, so much of our soul is tied up in our physical environment, and in particular, in our squares, in our beautiful tree canopy. And I don't know the numbers, Kevin probably does, but 40% of downtown is within the public realm, something like that. So we have a tremendous amount of our land area belongs to the public. If you go to these soulless areas where the Walmarts and the Targets are, it's probably 5% belongs to the public. And there's a total disconnect between the public realm and the private realm, and that connection that exists downtown is, of course, so much of what adds the value to downtown. So I'm curious, I guess, Joe, do you have a way in which you communicate that value of the relationships between the public and the private realm in your financial analysis? And then for Savannah, it's as an urban planner, it is very difficult to see the mistakes that we make in other areas when we have a national and international model for urban planning. But we don't seem to appreciate those quality of life and soul providing elements in our areas of outside of downtown. So how do we translate that into dollars and into a message that will resonate so that we can have the courage and the leadership to provide areas of soul?
That's a real easy question. I tend to think of real estate like a big stick of butter. It's all kind of worth the same, generally speaking, until there's an intervention. If the hand of God comes down and pushes down into the stick of butter and creates an ocean, the value of that dirt doesn't disappear, it just slides to the edge. So you get this, the butter moves up around the thumb. And if you go to particularly like on the east coast of South Florida, you see like a wall of condominiums down the beach, capturing that value that's been transferred to that edge dirt, right? To some extent, Oglethorpe was doing the same thing. By putting those parks down, those values didn't disappear, it just slid to the edge. Now, by giving more people access to those parks, you draw that value further into the butter stick because more people can walk there. But clearly, you're paying a premium to be on the park versus half a block away. So that's the art of planning: is can you make that value transfer through? Yet you're not getting any tax dollars out of it, but you're getting a transference of wealth over. If you want, I've got a great real estate analysis paper on this from 1913. John Nolan did this analysis in Landscape Architecture magazine because Somerville was combating Cambridge. In Cambridge, they were discussing doing parks in Cambridge, and everybody was like, whoa, we're going to lose tax value. That's taxable property that we're putting into the public realm. And his argument was like, well, no, you're going to see the value gain adjacent and also into the neighborhood. And he did a comparative analytic between Somerville, which chose to do no parks, versus Cambridge. I think that lesson, you have it right here playing out for you, writ large. So you have that analysis. You can actually go back in time and pull values. I mean, if you really want to get super nerdy, and just see how the value of this place has held its own through, the disurbanization of the 70s, where urban environments were pummeled, through all the ups and downs. Downtown has held that value. When you go out into the suburban environment, we've essentially pushed off those costs onto, we had a conversation about parking earlier. What we've done in our tax system is you're giving me a reward if I take over the parking responsibility. So I get a discount with the more land I use. The bigger the parcel of land I have, the cheaper the value I have. So if I'm, this is like super, super nerdy, perverse, disturbing, and you need to know this. If I live across the street from any of y'all, and you have 1/10 of an acre of land, and I got an acre of land, the per square foot value of my dirt is a lot cheaper than your dirt. There's a standard inside assessment theory that the more land you have, the lower the per unit cost of that land, which is absolutely ridiculous if you consider what a city is, which is a finite boundary of land, or even worse, a county. Chatham County doesn't go out and annex the next county over, so all the dirt that Chatham County has is the dirt that it has. So there's a financial incentive that I have when I put a surface parking down, and I doubled down on that when I put asphalt on it. Because when the asphalt goes down, the assessor, rightly so, goes out and goes, well, it's asphalt, it's worth $5 a square foot. So that urban environment that has more building on it is paying more taxes and is more productive. So that's what happens with something like the suburban environment. And I would argue with you whether or not that's public realm, because it's really on private property. The only thing that's public about it is the Strode that you all have built that's adjacent to the real estate. We were driving through Greensboro one day, and Chuck had this breakdown in the car. He's in the passenger seat. It just cracked me up. We're just driving through these endless Strodes all around the Greensboro Triad area, and it was like strip mall after strip mall, mall after mall. I'm getting out in the parking lot and taking pictures and just driving to the next strip mall. And Chuck just goes, I can't believe people don't see this. How much does this road cost? Joe, what does that property pay in taxes? And I'm like, about $200,000. He's like, that doesn't pay for the road. Yeah. And it just...
Here's a hydrant,
yeah.
here's a hydrant.
If, as a planner, the best service you can do is figure out the cross-sectional cost of that road, and then just what is it per linear foot of frontage, and then go and look at the tax bill. Just really simple. And just show it to a politician and say, look, this is the deal, this is the deal. I mean, it's mind-blowing. You'll just watch their heads splatter all over the wall. It's just, and it makes zero financial sense. It's the simplest model to do. Just go to your engineer and just say, what's the cost for this road per linear foot to rebuild it? I mean, it's just basically the model that Chuck did. And then go look at the tax bill for that large parcel of land. And it doesn't make sense.
I want to ask Chuck a question real fast. When we were talking earlier, and I think I understood you right, I agree with you about small things that can really help that don't cost a lot of money. But in that same conversation, I think you made the comment that you're not a planner and that you really didn't like master planning for communities. And it's important, I really want to hear your comments on this, because Savannah Development Renewal Authority and the City of Savannah and the Metropolitan Planning Commission are currently just beginning the concept of reinitiating what we consider would be a good master plan and visionary for the community. And there may be some really negative points to it, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. I said I'm a planner who doesn't believe in planning. I'm an engineer who doesn't believe in current engineering practice either. So I'm an outlier, and I see that. To me, like if we're going to say, like, what is a great plan? A great plan creates a framework where we can all individually and collectively prosper. It doesn't try to dictate, here's how much commercial property we need, here's how much residential property we need. It doesn't say, here's where we need to make millions of dollars of investment to induce growth. It creates, the Oglethorpe plan is a brilliant plan. Because if you look at this framework, it's a framework that can be little cottages, and then larger houses, and then larger houses yet, and then, 6-story buildings. It's a framework that can grow with you, with your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations. To me, as planners, we should be humble and be looking at how can we create frameworks that are flexible, frameworks that are adaptable, and frameworks that, and this is where the anti-fragile comes in, provide us feedback so that we can learn from the good and learn from the bad, fix the bad early before it gets worse, and our community can be able to grow and adapt over time. I think the worst plan, suburban planning is like insane to me. And I've seen these plans, and they just like, I'm like, this is not planning. This is a fairy tale on paper. They'll go out and they'll say, well, here's our Strode. We're going to put, $20 million into building this. Then we're going to zone all this here. Here's our absorption rates. Here's what we're projected to grow. And they go out, and it is a plan in the same way an assembly line is a plan, right? But it's an assembly line for like a product you don't want. We did a graphic a few years ago that I think was really powerful that nobody looked at, but I thought was really, really good. It juxtaposed a cornfield and the rainforest, and then a suburban development and a traditional development. And it went something like this. It was like, rainforest is to cornfield as traditional development is to suburban development. It's something like that. But the idea was,
in a rainforest, you have this massively complex ecosystem where everything interacts with everything else in ways that you can study for a lifetime and not completely grasp. There's subtle relationships, there's feedback loops, there's equilibrium that are attached to that. They're complex ecosystems. A cornfield is one thing. It's about the production of corn. And we measure good by how much corn do we get. And we have inputs and we have outputs and we have corn production. In a city that works, you have, again, this like ecosystem. And it is an ecosystem of economics, yes, but it's also of social and cultural interaction. It's all this stuff combined. And we can't really pull that out of a cookbook. You can't plan that. You can create the framework under which it grows and you can nurture it. But you can't set out and say 50 years from now, if we put this pipe in here and this widest street in here, we'll have this target here and then that's an ecosystem. It's vastly more complex than that. The suburban development pattern is all about the cornfield. It's all about repeating over and over and getting GDP growth and jobs, and as measured in housing units and targets and Walmart's, like over and over and over and over. And the reason why it's fragile is because when the storm comes in, it knocks out the cornfield and that cornfield's dead. And you gotta wait till next year to grow. When the storm comes in and knocks out, there's a little bit of hardship in that pattern, it doesn't stand up, it's not resilient. So if you're doing a plan for adaptability, plan for resilience, plan a framework where we can all experience prosperity. I think that's where the plan revision needs to go. And we're not there yet, but I've seen places where they've done it. Thank you.
Very short question. Two communities that have done this type of planning full form. There's two cities that have done it spot on.
In the United States?
Yes.
I'll pass.
Anywhere.
I'm going to pick up off, I'm going to do a little shout out to the Canadians. Canadians here, awesome.
Oh yeah,
Canadians Now we know where he is. The Canadians have an interesting approach to their cities, or at least the Canadians that I've experienced, and they treat it very much like a social corporation. And that's their attitude going into it, that there's a shared common sacrifice for a shared common gain. And coming from the States, I immediately assume that these are a bunch of freakoid socialists that want to tax themselves a lot. And one of the things that we found is that their tax rates are no different from ours, and in some cases they're paying less taxes. But what they get is so much more social services, so much more human resource. So the human component, which you all have talked about with your soul and how you want to feel in your community and the people in certain neighborhoods that are being left behind or not represented, these are people. And in Canada, that's part of the process. That's no different than talking about a sewer pipe. It's all part of the community and how it's all coming together as a group. Being data nerds the way that we are, I won't step out on a limb and say why this is happening other than the fact of how they're making their investments in their community. And I'm hedging, it's because they don't buy down so much infrastructure that they actually have money left over in their bank account to put into people. So they tend to have a better job training, school system, education, healthcare. The cities have LGBT clinics that they pay for out of city budgets. And they're like, well, it's a human service. We need to talk with people about depression and other kind of social issues, and this is just part of who we are. And that's just straight across the board. And so we see in the results of that, just put two cities side by side, Detroit and Windsor, directly across the river from each other. Both have manufacturing bases that are American cars. Both suffered the same unemployment issues. In Detroit, the homicide rate per 100,000 people is 9.2 people per 100,000. In Windsor, it's 0.7. It's just like, and you look at that and say, well, there's a Canadian. They don't look any different from us. I mean, there he is. It's like, he walks on 2 feet. He ate food. He probably drinks some sweet tea even, and yet you're seeing how, from a humanistic standpoint, how they deal with their community and where they put their priority of what they want to fund. Now, in the States, it's a little bit, it's much more of a knuckle fight. I think like Fort Collins, Colorado is doing some cool stuff. Different cities are doing different things, but nothing at the level of what the Canadians are doing.
Let me, and we can finish after this. So I'm going to answer your question by rejecting it in the sense that I think it is a post-war question. I've written a number of times that the difference between pre-depression development patterns and post-depression, post-war development patterns is not the automobile and suburbs as we've known it. There's a byproduct of it. There's two components of it that we have to understand and zero in on. Post-war development built in large increments to a finished state, where pre-depression development patterns for thousands of years built in small increments on a continuous ongoing basis. So the question was, what city has done it right? Like and I'm telling you, zero, none. None has ever done it right. It's never been perfect. It's never done. Because cities are a journey. They're not the destination. It is traditional development patterns are always growing and changing and incrementally improving. This is where I struggle with the historic preservationists, because we're on the same page that we shouldn't be just like willy-nilly tearing down old historic buildings because they're in the way. But we also can't put our cities under glass and say they will never change. If we put them under glass and say they'll never change, they die. So don't ever think like, what's the city that we copy? What's the city that did it right? What's the city that's reached nirvana? Because no one ever gets there. It's like saying, who here is in perfect health? Well, that's an ongoing thing, right? And when you're 60, perfect health means something a lot different than when you're 20, right? We all, it's a journey, it's a process of improvement and of getting better. And I think if we keep that in mind, we will measure success not in the result, but in the improvement. And we'll realize that no matter where we are, we always have improvement to make, and we always can look back on improvement we've done.
Well, Chuck, think about the journey that Savannah has taken over the last 60 years. Dicky, in 1955 or 56, downtown Savannah wasn't the place that it is today. And it has been small, incremental improvements. It's not part of a great city father's master plan. There were some ladies that came along that wanted to save old buildings. But what really made downtown Savannah what it is today were individual people rebuilding individual houses. Now, it got helped along by the Savannah College of Art and Design. It got helped along by a lot of other things that happened, but it was the small people that ultimately made it work. It wasn't part of a highly detailed, formal master plan.
Right.
And have we made some mistakes along the way? Oh yes, lots. So we're not perfect. But I hope that what will happen in the future as a result of the conversations today is that we will have learned from the mistakes that we've made and not make them again, and picked up some ideas of how we might do even better job in the future. Some of that will be not making the mistakes again, but some of that will be trying new things and ideas that we've picked up from you, Chuck, and you, Joe. So I'd like to sort of conclude things, if I can, Dicky, by thanking you, Chuck, and Joe, and Kevin, you, and Dicky, you, for having the wisdom and the vision for making this all come together. Thank you. I've enjoyed it, and I hope that the audience is inspired as I am as a result of it.
Well, have a nice night.